As much as a model railroad is built to, model a railroad, you need context for the world around it to make the railroad feel like it's actually going somewhere. After all, railroads are built to connect places together. What's the point of connecting those places if there's nothing there to connect? The only building that I had at the start of this project was a passenger station. Sure, that's good for passengers, but where's the town, Mansley? We need buildings, we need roads, we need people, we need to make this world feel lived in. So let's do just that. I built a total of 3 building kits for the town, but I'm only going to heavily focus on the hardest one while skimming over the other 2. The freight house was definitely the hardest building to build of these 3. It was made by Bantam Model Works and honestly wasn't that hard to do, but the posts that lift the building off the ground were a bit more involved than I'm used to and a lot more work than the other 2 kits that I made. Instead of using laser-cut wood that nicely notched together for this part, the Banta kit has a bag of sticks that you have to cut to length yourself and then shove into a template to glue the pieces together. The template comprised of 2 cardboard laser-cut pieces, which I simply superglued together. Honestly, this wasn't that bad to deal with at first. Once I got the measurements for how all the pieces should be cut, the chopper made short work of everything. It didn't take long to build all 8 sections required. The one annoying thing at this stage was wood glue. Since the template was made of cardboard, the glue would sometimes stick to more than just the wood, and it took a little bit of force to separate the components from the template. Sometimes this force was strong enough that the pieces that I was building got torn apart. And that's not even the worst of it, though we'll talk about that when the time comes. In between making these supports, since I needed to wait for the glue to dry, I focused on building the doors and the windows. As with any wood kit, this started by cutting out the detail parts from the wood flash. For the door and window frames, I painted them with Ceramcoat Brown Iron Oxide, and for the main door panels, I went with Ceramcoat Maple Wood Stain. Once the paint and stain had a little time to dry, I glued the door pieces together. For the interior window frames, I painted them in Badger Modelflex Dark Tuscan Oxide Red. I know I'm using a lot of my favorite colors today, sue me. Next, I cut the transparent window materials from their flash and carefully removed the tissue paper from their backs. To glue those in place on the interior frame, I used canopy cement. There were also 2 separate segments to each frame, so I just glued them together with the canopy glue while I was at it. I then shifted to the main structure, starting by painting the floor and dock of the building, which I just used some maple wood stain to color. I then cut out the windows and door holes from the wallboard and glued the main walls together. This was pretty easy to pull off since the walls had notches in them for alignment, but this is a good point to mention that I may have received an older version of this kit. To help save some money, since, let's be honest, being a YouTuber doesn't pay very well unless you have a certain amount of monthly supporters, I bought these kits from a secondary seller on eBay instead of buying them straight from Banta. I think I saved about $50 or $60 between the 2 kits I bought, but the 2 kits I received both seemed to not entirely match their instructions. Most notably were these walls. According to the instructions I got, they had notches on the bottom of them to line them up with the floor of the building. The floor also had notches in these instructions. Clearly, that's not the case with the product I received. I'm not sure why that is, but it is worth mentioning that I bought these kits through a secondary seller, and that might have had something to do with it. Anyways, in continuing my theme of favorite colors for this building, once the walls had all been glued in place, I painted them in Ceramcoat Territorial Beige. I then glued in the doors and windows using canopy glue. I didn't do 2 of the windows on the back of the model though, since it's in such a hard place to see that most people will never even notice they're not there. At this point in layout creation, I was trying to cut every corner I possibly could to save on time, since the train show was in less than a week. So, why worry about the back of a building? Nobody's gonna notice. The same mindset applied to the next step, which was adding trim to the building. I only cut the trim for the front. Not even the sides, just the front. I painted the trim in brown iron oxide to match the door and window frames, and glued them in place with wood glue once again. To finish the general shape of the main building, I glued on the roof. The 45-degree angle was a bit unforgiving, though, and the pieces rarely stayed in place for long, so I kinda just had to let it rest. Prayer did eventually work out, and once the roof was firmly in place, I got to work adding strips of masking tape. I don't remember what kind of roofing material this is supposed to represent, but it's very easy and very cheap to do. Making it so each strip of tape slightly overlaps with the last strip makes this nice roofing material. Just remember to be careful when you're trimming down the ends of the roof. You don't want to stab yourself with a knife while you're smoothing out the tape. With that all in place, I then painted the whole roof in black. It took a few coats of paint before the masking tape started to disappear. Next came the base of the building. At this point, all of the supports had been done gluing for a long time, so I glued the assemblies to the bottom of the dock. I then added supports to the main building and tried to fit it together with the dock. And with that, I was done. Or at least I thought I was. This is where trouble arose. I was able to do everything first try and the building was ready to go, but when compared to the height of the cars that I was running, the loading dock was way too high. So, back to the drawing board. I started by making some small notches on the post for how low the building was supposed to sit, and then using a small saw to cut the pieces down. This did not go according to plan. I very quickly broke off one of the posts. I wish I could say that was the only time this happened. It wasn't. In the end, I wound up breaking off and cutting more posts than I was able to keep on and just trim naturally. Eventually, I got everything in place, but the building was supposed to sit in a location where a little bit of the ground got in the way of the floor of the building. To give it some more room to sit, we took a hammer and chisel and chipped away at the scenery to make a nice little niche for the building to sit in. And voila! We have a nice little freight depot for the railroad. This is basically how all of the town buildings went, more or less. Of the other buildings that we had for the town, the station was already built when I bought it. Nothing to really say there. The little green building, I actually want to make that its own video. The kit was only $20 and pretty easy to build. I think it would make for a great topic to help introduce people into building wooden kits. Unfortunately, I actually screwed this building up. I put the windows in backwards, and in my haste to get things done quickly, I accidentally painted over parts of the windows. Most people won't ever notice that, but it does annoy me. The green building was a Make It With Calvin false front building. The other one, Ramona's Room for Rent by Pacific Northwest Miniatures, I actually used superglue on the windows. We were flat out of canopy glue and I wanted a quick and dirty solution. The superglue actually dried pretty clear if I was careful with it. Of course, I was only careful with it about half the time, and I would not recommend trying this at home. It is worth mentioning as a weird alternative, though. With the buildings done, I had to fit them into the landscape in the world. The terrain was really only designed for the station and freight depot and not much else. So, for the other two town buildings, and the road that connects everything together, I had to add some extra terrain. After vacuuming up any loose ballast and grass, I added a mixture of clays that my father mixed up for me to build the general shape of everything. Once enough clay had been added so the main area was flat enough for the buildings, I chiseled out a little bit of room from the mountains so the buildings could sit closer to the mountain. That way, they would just be a little bit farther back from the railroad and make the town feel a little more welcoming. While today's video is mostly focused on the town scene, I did also record a bit of road building by the mine scene. I think it's worth mentioning here because of the railroad crossings. After all, there was not one, but 2 railroad crossings that I had to build in that region. And, unfortunately, I built all of the railroad crossings wrong on this layout. See, I thought that I could get away with laying the clay ground group up to the edge of the rail, and then flatten it down by hand to make sure there was clearance on the edge of the rail so that trains wouldn't have any trouble running over it. I was wrong with that assumption. The clay was super bumpy, and, in hindsight, this is something I may have to fix on the little loop. I should have used the same material for the edge of the crossing as I did for the interior. That being, scribed wood. It's consistently flat, lies below the railhead, and adds a nice texture and a little bit of charm to the crossing. And let me tell you, at the train show, trains very consistently derailed at these railroad crossings. Some rolling stock handled better than others did, but man, we had to take so many of the hoppers off the railroad. Getting the actual shape of the crossing was kind of tricky though. While the main line at the mine was straight, the siding was curved, and so was the crossing by the passenger station in the town. I didn't really show it on camera, but I had to carve the edges of the boards to give clearance for the flanges in line with the rest of the curve. And yes, I tried cutting them before putting the pieces between the rails. It never really fully worked out, and I always had to go back with a knife and smooth it out a little bit. I also had to cut the angle of the road on some occasions. The crossings were very much not perpendicular to the tracks. With that done and out of the way though, I started painting the roads. For the crossings, I used Ceramcoat maple wood stain, as I always seem to like to do. For the roads, I started with a layer of dark brown, just to give it a nice base dirt color before I started adding the actual tone that I wanted. And, well, at this point we can see another problem with putting the ground group so close to the rails. I wound up painting over the rails pretty frequently while trying to paint the roads. I never let the paint dry, but the fact that it happened so much was an annoying problem that if you're going to try and repeat these steps, you should absolutely consider. I then don't have any footage for the rest of the road work, which is either because the files got deleted, in which case, why did I delete them, or because I didn't record this part, in which case, why did I not record this? This is important. At least with the buildings earlier in this video, I could show off one building and use that as a sample for the other two, but the roads? Let me ramble about those in a second. First, let's get some other background footage going. I added a base for the passenger station. This included cutting a wood deck out of the scribed wood, adding a layer of cork roadbed to rise it to track level, smoothing out the edges with some of the older style of ground goop, and dry brushing the station platform to give it a nice wooden texture that stood out a little bit from the nearby railroad crossings colors. Alright, roads that I didn't record. The process was actually pretty simple. After the base brown coat of paint dried, I went back with a second base coat to touch up any of the original color and to try and make sure that none of the white/gray of the original clay was showing through. Once that had some time to dry, I added a coat of Ceramcoat Territorial Beige. However, I brushed it on with a smaller brush and did not spend any time trying to paint the small dips and holes in the texture of the road. This way, the road was much more of a tannish brown color that matched the rest of the landscape better, but the original base brown was still able to shine through in a couple of spots. I followed this up with a second coat of Territorial Beige to touch up any spots that felt like they were too brown. To help add even more color and texture, I used an orangish-brown rust-colored pan pastel to add texture to the road. In most areas, I tried to make the rust form two lines to imply tire tracks as a car would drive down the road. In some spots where the road would see more frequent use, such as around the station, railroad crossing, or the heart of town, I tried to spread out the texture more randomly. This was all improvised, and I'm gonna be honest, I think this turned out really well. I probably should have looked at other techniques before doing this, but I'm proud of how this road turned out. At this point, the world had plenty of structure to it, but no real life. So I got to work adding little details to help make the world pop. To add freight traffic and a little bit of quote-unquote industrial furniture, I grabbed a handful of barrels and crates from Wiseman Model Services and painted them all in Ceramcoat brown iron oxide. The barrels needed a coat of primer at first though, which I got my father to help with by airbrushing some on. I glued most of these crates and barrels in places around the passenger station and freight depot to help give them a little bit more of a working feel. Now, humans are important, but they're not the only creatures you'll find out in the world. I wasn't able to afford much, but I ordered some dogs and rabbits from Wiseman Model Services and painted them up in some generic colors. The two dogs are Silver and Cookie. Both of them don't really have super complicated paint jobs, but I did try to give them two tones to make them stand out a little more. Cookie sits in the heart of town, staring at a man eating lunch, and Silver sits at the mine watching trains run by. For the rabbits, I painted them in 4 different colors, with only 1 color per rabbit. 3 I painted up in sandstone, 2 in territorial beige, 2 in brown iron oxide, and 1 in gray. I spread them out around the layout in a bunch of different locations, and some of them are pretty easy to find, and some of them are extremely devious, so if you ever see the little loop in person, see if you can spot them all. I'm willing to bet you won't. For actual factual humans, my father got me some Artista figures for Christmas. In total, we got about 6 characters, most of them being drunkards because they kind of fit the aesthetic of the period well. Unfortunately, I didn't get any footage of adding these figures because I had to do it the day the show began. I was in way more of a rush trying to make the layout presentable than trying to get more footage for YouTube at that point. It's not much of a town, but the small selection of buildings here really goes a long way to help make the world feel alive. I definitely learned some things from building this town. Read instructions so you don't screw up buildings, give enough clearance around the track, but most importantly, wow, a town really finishes up a layout visually in a big way. I should have built this much sooner. It would have given me more time to finish some details I forgot like stovepipes, but also might have given me more motivation to finish this layout if I saw how close to completion it really was. I'm really liking building scenery the more and more I do it. Maybe I need to start planning the next big project so I have an excuse to do more, eh? Well, okay, I'm 2 steps ahead there, but that's another subject for another video. Thanks for watching. Cheers, folks.